What are some of the biggest pieces of hype about cannabis that you tend to run into regularly that kind of need to be addressed? Hype and common misconceptions that you come across regularly.
Yeah. Well, first of all, and we've talked about this, is I think there's just a lot of misinformation, and I think that gets hyped up. People will start a word and then everybody else takes it off in a different direction. So be careful of the misinformation, which is happening. The other thing too is we got to look at ratios.
THC CBD ratios.
We got to look at ratios, and if you're going to use it medically, you're going to have to pay attention to this stuff. It's one thing to have a good time on a weekend and do whatever. But if you really want to use it as a medicine, you have to have some intention in it. And so getting off these other trains of, 35% THC and, 0% THC and 13% CBD. It's one extreme to another. And so I think that we need to stay away from those trends and really do what's best for the individual. And that's just a personal journey. So those two are big, as far as strains, like flower, there's always a new strain every day.
Yeah.
And then that strain gets basically crossed out to every other good strain, what we call strain. And this continuously happens over and over and over. One thing good about Phylos that they did bring is the fact that it shows really how much it's not varied.
Yeah.
If you look at their galaxy, you can see all these strains and how really close related they are. And so I don't like to see people getting on a trend of one brand and then just dropping it a month later. For one, that's showing that it's not a medicine. And two, it's just how consumers are. We want choices. We want a lot of them. And once we're done with it, it's out the window. And we see that a lot with cannabis. The strains that I grow, that I personally try to grow, are all good strains, but they're not all these hype strains.
Yeah.
And whether they're good or not, that's for the individual to decide. It's not for a grower or a breeder or the looks of it. I'm a big believer in outdoor, sun-grown. I don't want to say outdoor, sun-grown. I believe in it. Without anything to back this, I believe that full spectrum equals full spectrum, loosely speaking. Meaning that if I'm getting everything nature has to provide in its environment, then I'm getting everything that plant hopefully is going to have in it genetically. And then we can enhance it to its potential in other ways. But having an artificial environment and stuff, I'm not so sure that is my particular favorite. But that's kind of a hype thing too, or a trendy thing too. Is who wants outdoor, who wants indoor? Everybody wants indoor because it looks great. Well, that's like saying I want to read this book because
the cover's nice.
It's got a nice leather cover. Well, that's great and all, but there may or may not be substance in there. But this is I think it's a younger generation trendy thing led. A lot of these older guys, in my generation, don't tend to be so trendy. They tend to try to seek out better information, whether that be facts or just their own facts on how it works for them. But we need to be aware of these things. So ratios, we need to, we can't let marketing terms drive our decisions.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you see, Jason? Besides all this, right at the consumer level. I mean,
well, I think right now there's a lot of hype around CBD that's exaggerated. there's a lot of hype around terpenes that I think is exaggerated.
That's what I was going to say too. That was the other one. We got to really be careful with terpenes, not only from a health standpoint, like you pointed out, but I don't know that terpenes are something to base.
It's a big unknown.
First of all, most of it's going to be myrcene or
right, some of these dominant
pinene
terpenes, and it depends on the age. If it's older cannabis that hasn't been stored well, then it's going to be primarily beta-caryophyllene and humulene. But one thing that I did an interview with Anthony, and I'm going to do another one with him, but one thing we talked about was problems interpreting research and how it's very common when a class of compounds gets hyped up to do some digging on research that's been done on those compounds, look for benefits or negative effects, depending on what sort of bias you're kind of operating from. And just a side note on that, everyone has a bias. And I thought that was something that was just generally well known. But I've actually run into several instances now where when I bring up the concept of bias, it's assumed that bias only runs one way, and that it's like you have a bias if you are looking for negative things about cannabis. And I'm like, well, no, there's a bias the other way too. In confirmation bias, it's just whatever you're bringing to the table. And we all have biases, and we have to recognize our own biases and try to be comfortable reviewing information that makes us feel uncomfortable because of those biases. So that's a big part of what I'm leading into about looking at research. But people will look up research about different compounds and they'll say, like these different terpenes, linalool and myrcene, limonene, all these things. Oh, they do X, Y, Z. They'll make a chart that has all of these terpenes or cannabinoids and then all these effects and have dots showing, what they do. And it gives consumers an impression that if they want to find a product that works for something that they're trying to treat, that they just need to look at this chart, figure out, what lines up, find a product that has a lot of that in it, and not recognizing the complexities around biomedical research, and that there's several pieces to it. One, there are different types of research, and you have to be careful about how you interpret that research in the context of the human body. There's cell culture research, so someone's taking a petri dish, they're growing certain cells, certain tissues, and exposing compounds to that, seeing what happens, and then extrapolating possible applications for that could then lead into animal trials and then later human trials. And then you've got in vivo animal trials, a lot of this being with rodents. And rodents have much faster metabolic rates than humans do. They behave a little differently, but a lot of good information can be gleaned from rodent studies. However, there are a lot of instances in biomedical research where the results that come from rodent models don't scale the way that seems intuitive to humans. And so that's a limitation. And then even in human clinical trials, there is a replication problem that science is dealing with broadly. It's really huge in like sociology and psychology, but it applies to all branches of science in that there's a lot of basic research that's been taken for granted that has not been replicated, or that when scientists have tried to replicate it, they don't get the same results. There's even a weird phenomenon where for certain types of research, the more you do the research, results change. And so it's very hard to make really straightforward claims about chemicals and what they're going to do, especially in the context of a complex matrix like a cannabis flower or even a cannabis extract that has, a variety of compounds in it. It's really hard to make any claims of what that's going to do for somebody. And so, like it or not, we're still in an area of trial and error. It's a shotgun effect. You try different things, you see what works. That's why I encourage journaling. Because if you get too caught up in trying to learn what these compounds, quote unquote, do, you can really get off track from what's most valuable. And so there's a lot of hype around terpenes and what they do, how they affect the entourage effect, that really there's not good data supporting a lot of those claims. There's some data that indicates that terpenes are a piece of the entourage effect puzzle. There are terpenes that have demonstrated affinity for cannabinoid receptors. And so obviously they're having effects on the endocannabinoid system in some way. But then you get into other issues of like, well, what's the concentration of these terpenes that are in there? How much is actually getting in your blood and reaching these cannabinoid receptors? Is it an appreciable amount, especially in the context of a complex matrix? How are those effects actually happening at these ultra low concentrations when they finally reach these receptors, when they're in the presence of other compounds competing for access to these receptors? And so that's a big piece. I just think we know a lot less than we often like to admit. And part of that plays into the ego games that different people and companies are playing, because if you can make people think that you know more than someone else, then you can build a sense of authority, and that helps your brand perform better in a market, even if your brand is yourself. And this is common in among even doctors. You can find doctors that have YouTube videos where they're talking about all kinds of different things, and some of them are really quality and they're really careful about how they talk about things, and some of them are not very careful at all. And it seems like they're purposefully trying to get an impression into someone's mind when they know better. They know that what they're saying is not as straightforward as how they're presenting it, but they want it to be perceived in a certain way so that when people see that, they're like, oh, this is the guy, or this is, the doctor, the nurse, the whoever that I need to pay attention to. There's a lot of that happening, and it's something I'm trying to even be aware of with myself when I talk about complex topics, that I slip up all the time, but trying to catch myself and make sure that I'm explaining nuance and providing context, because I don't want people to generate assumptions that aren't well-founded. And so that relates to terpenes. It relates to CBD as well. All these medical benefits that are getting claimed about CBD, I'm sure some of them are valid. I'm sure a lot of them are valid in certain contexts.